He saved 2 Apache women from the ice 3 days later. 30 surrounded his cabin. Pick one or both. The winter that year was harsher than anyone remembered. Snow had fallen early and stayed longer than usual, covering the mountains, trees, and narrow paths in thick white layers. The river near the man's cabin had begun to freeze weeks ago, but it was not fully solid. Large sheets of ice floated on dark, fast-moving water beneath. Anyone who knew the land understood that the river was dangerous in winter, especially at night. The man lived alone in a small wooden cabin not far from that river. He had built it himself years earlier, choosing the place because it was quiet and far from towns. He was not running from anything, he simply liked distance. His days were simple and predictable. He woke before sunrise, chopped wood, checked traps, repaired tools, and cooked basic meals. He spoke little to others, not because he was unfriendly, but because he preferred silence. The land, the wind, and the fire kept him company. That evening, the sky was already dark when he stepped outside with his coat pulled tight around his shoulders. The wind cut sharply through the trees, carrying the sound of branches cracking under the weight of snow. He planned only to gather a little more firewood before night fully settled in. The cold was strong enough to sting his face, but he was used to it. Winters like this had shaped him into a man who moved carefully and wasted no energy. As he worked, he suddenly paused. At first, he thought the wind was playing tricks on him. Then he heard it again, a faint sound, almost swallowed by the storm. It did not belong to the forest. It sounded like a voice, weak and broken, carried unevenly through the air. He stood still, listening, his breath forming clouds in front of him. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was not one voice, but 2. He dropped the wood and turned toward the river. Every instinct told him the water was dangerous, especially in the dark. Still, the sound did not fade. It grew sharper, filled with fear and exhaustion. Without stopping to think further, he grabbed a rope and a lantern from inside the cabin and moved quickly toward the riverbank. The snow made every step slow. His boots sank deep as he pushed through the brush. The lantern light bounced over uneven ground, revealing broken branches and frozen mud. As he reached the edge of the river, the sound became painfully clear. 2 women were trapped near the ice. One was half kneeling on a cracked sheet of ice, clutching the arm of the other, who was dangerously close to the open water. Their clothes were soaked, darkened by cold river water. Their movements were slow, weakened by freezing temperatures. Every time the ice shifted beneath them, they cried out, afraid it would break completely. The man's heart tightened. He had seen animals fall through ice before. He knew how quickly strength disappeared in water this cold. There was no time to wait or plan carefully. He shouted to them, telling them to stay still. His voice sounded strange in the open space, louder than he expected. The women looked toward him, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They had not expected anyone to be nearby. From the way they stared at him, it was clear they were already near the edge of their strength. He tied one end of the rope around a sturdy tree behind him, testing it hard to make sure it would hold. Then he slowly lowered himself toward the ice, keeping his weight spread out, moving inch by inch. The ice cracked loudly under him, sharp sounds echoing across the river. Cold water seeped through his gloves as he reached forward. The woman closest to the water slipped suddenly. Her hand disappeared beneath the surface, and she cried out. Without thinking, he lunged forward, gripping her arm and pulling with everything he had. The rope tightened around his waist as he leaned back, using his weight to drag her toward solid ground. The cold hit him hard. Ice water splashed over his legs, stealing his breath for a moment. Pain shot through his body, but he held on. Slowly, carefully, he pulled her free, then reached again for the second woman. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering so hard he feared she might lose control of her hands. He spoke to her calmly, even though his own heart was racing. He told her to look at him, to move only when he said so. She nodded weakly. With one careful pull after another, he brought her off the ice and onto the frozen ground beside him. The moment both women were safely away from the river, his strength finally gave way. He collapsed to his knees, breathing hard, his clothes soaked and heavy. The women lay beside him, barely moving, their faces tight with pain and shock. He forced himself back up. The danger was not over. Leaving them in the open would still cost them their lives. He wrapped the rope around them gently and guided them back toward the cabin, half carrying, half dragging them through the snow. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit them immediately. He moved fast, placing the women near the fire, removing their wet outer clothing with care and respect, covering them in thick blankets. He added more wood to the fire until the flames burned strong and steady. He brought warm water and slowly helped them drink. Their hands were stiff and pale, but color began to return as the heat worked its way back into their bodies. Neither woman spoke much. They seemed too tired, too overwhelmed by what had just happened. He did not ask who they were or how they ended up at the river. He had learned long ago that not every moment required questions. Sometimes, what mattered most was simply keeping someone alive. Hours passed quietly. The storm outside howled against the cabin walls, but inside, there was only the crackle of firewood and the slow sound of breathing. The women eventually fell into a deep, heavy sleep. The man sat nearby, watching the fire, his own clothes drying as steam rose faintly from the fabric. As the night wore on, he thought about how close they had come to dying. A few more minutes in the water would have taken their strength completely. If he had chosen to ignore the sound, if he had convinced himself it was only the wind, the outcome would have been very different. Just before dawn, one of the women stirred. She looked around the cabin, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. When she saw him sitting nearby, she pushed herself upright despite her weakness. She spoke softly, thanking him. Her voice was calm but carried deep emotion. The other woman soon woke as well. Both women made it clear they needed to leave as soon as they were able. He offered them food, and they ate slowly, regaining some strength. They spoke little about themselves, only enough to express gratitude and say they would not forget what he had done. When the sun finally rose, pale and cold over the snow-covered land, the women stood at the door of the cabin. They looked stronger now, though still tired. Before leaving, they met his eyes once more, as if memorizing his face. Then they stepped into the snow and disappeared into the trees. The man watched until they were gone. He felt no pride, no sense of reward. To him, it was simple. Someone was in danger and he had helped. He closed the door, added wood to the fire, and returned to his daily routine, believing the moment had passed. He did not know that what he saw as a single act of kindness had already begun to move forces far beyond his quiet life. He could not imagine that within days, the silence around his cabin would be broken, not by wind or storm, but by people who believed that saving a life carried a meaning deeper than he ever intended. The morning after the women left, the man woke earlier than usual. The fire had burned low and the cabin felt colder than normal, even though the weather had not changed. He sat up slowly, listening. The forest was quiet, but it was not the peaceful silence he was used to. It felt alert, as if something unseen was moving just beyond his awareness. He stood, stretched his stiff muscles, and added more wood to the fire. As the flames grew, his thoughts returned to the night at the river. He remembered the sound of cracking ice, the weight of the rope around his waist, and the fear in the women's eyes. He had rescued people before in small ways, offering directions, sharing food, but never something like that. Still, he told himself there was no reason to dwell on it. They had survived. That was enough. He stepped outside to begin his usual routine. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the ground smoothly. As he walked a short distance from the cabin, something caught his attention. There were tracks near the edge of the trees. They were not his, and they were not from animals. The marks were light but clear, made by careful steps. He knelt and studied them for a moment, then stood again. People passed through the forest from time to time. It meant nothing, he told himself. Throughout the day, small details continued to unsettle him. A bird took flight suddenly, as if startled by movement. Far off, he thought he saw figures on a ridge, but when he looked again, there was only rock and snow. The feeling stayed with him, like a low sound that never fully stopped. That evening, he returned to the river to check the place where he had found the women. The ice had shifted again. Broken sheets were piled along the edge, frozen in place. He stood there for a long time, staring at the water. The river showed no sign of what had happened, as if it had already erased the danger. Miles away, the two women moved carefully through the land they knew well. They did not speak much as they traveled. Their bodies were still sore, but they were alive, and that mattered more than comfort. When they reached their people, their arrival caused surprise and relief. Questions came quickly, and they answered honestly. They spoke of the river, the ice, and the cold that stole their strength. They spoke of the man who had appeared from the storm without hesitation. They described his cabin, his calm voice, and the way he had risked himself without asking who they were or why they were there. As they spoke, others listened closely. This was not just a story of survival. To their people, saving a life carried weight and meaning. Elders spoke quietly among themselves. The rescue was discussed not as an accident but as an action that created responsibility. Traditions older than memory guided their thinking. When someone stepped into such danger for others, it formed a bond that could not be ignored. Doing nothing would be a failure of respect. Back at the cabin, the man spent the second night restless. The wind pressed hard against the walls, rattling the shutters. He dreamed of the river, of reaching out and finding only empty water. He woke before dawn, his heart beating faster than usual. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the fire crackle softly. The next day passed much like the one before, but the feeling followed him everywhere. He sensed eyes on him even when he stood alone in open ground. At one point, he heard a distant call echo through the hills. It was not a sound he recognized, but it faded before he could place it. He sharpened his tools that afternoon, more for focus than necessity. His hands moved steadily, but his thoughts drifted. He wondered if the women had reached safety. He hoped they were warm, surrounded by people who cared for them. He had no desire to see them again, not out of indifference, but because he believed some meetings were meant to happen only once. As the sun dipped low on the third day, the air grew heavy and still. Even the wind seemed to pause. The man stood outside his cabin, watching the sky turn pale gray. Then he heard it, the sound of many footsteps, steady and deliberate, coming from several directions. He did not panic. Panic had never helped him in difficult moments. Instead, he took a slow breath and waited. Shapes emerged from the trees, then more from the slopes above. Men on foot and on horseback moved into the clearing, their numbers growing until his cabin stood at the center of a wide circle. They stopped at a respectful distance, not crowding, not shouting. There was no anger in their faces, only purpose. The man stood still, his hands open at his sides. He understood now that the feeling he had carried for days had been a warning, not of danger but of change. One man stepped forward from the group. He was older, his posture calm and steady. His eyes were sharp but not unkind. He spoke clearly, explaining why they had come. He named the women the man had rescued and spoke of the river and the ice. As the words settled in the cold air, the man felt the weight of what he was hearing. He had believed the rescue ended at his door. He was beginning to understand that for others it was only the beginning. The leader finished speaking and waited. The circle remained silent. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now stood surrounded by lives, traditions, and expectations the man had never planned to face. The circle around the cabin remained quiet for a long moment. Snow lay untouched between the men, their horses standing calmly, breath rising in soft clouds. The man felt the cold on his face, but inside his thoughts were steady. He looked from one face to another, noticing that no one raised a weapon, no one stepped closer than needed. Whatever this moment was, it was not chaos. It was something planned. The older man who had spoken first waited patiently. He did not rush, did not repeat himself. He seemed to understand that the words he had shared needed time to settle. When the man from the cabin finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "I helped because they were in danger," he said. "Nothing more." The older man nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. He replied that intention mattered, but so did action. To his people, saving a life was not a small thing. It created a connection that could not be ignored or pushed aside like snow from a doorway. The rescue had been seen, spoken of, and understood as a serious responsibility. The man listened closely. He did not interrupt. He had lived alone long enough to know that speaking less often meant hearing more truth. The older man continued, explaining that the two women were under the protection of their people. They had nearly been lost to the river, and the man's actions had changed their path. Because of that, a decision had to be made, one that honored both the women and the man who had stepped into danger for them. Then the older man said the words that had already begun to travel through the group like a quiet wind. He spoke them carefully, without force, without raising his voice. The meaning was serious but not cruel. "You are asked to choose," he said, "one path or another. You may take responsibility for one life, or you may take responsibility for both." The words settled heavily in the air. The man felt no anger, but he did feel surprise. He had expected questions, perhaps even thanks. He had not expected his life to be placed at a crossing like this. He looked down at the snow near his boots, then back up at the older man. "I don't understand," he said honestly. "I didn't save them to claim anything." The older man accepted this without offense. He explained that the choice was not about claiming or taking. It was about standing by an action already taken. To his people, helping someone survive created a bond of care and duty. Ignoring that bond would leave the story unfinished and unbalanced. The men around the circle remained silent, but their attention never wavered. Some were young, some older. All of them watched with patience. This was not a moment for shouting or pressure. It was a moment for clarity. The man asked for time to think. He did not demand it. He simply stated the need. After a brief pause, the older man agreed. He signaled, and the group shifted slightly, giving the man space without leaving the clearing. The man stepped back inside his cabin and closed the door. The warmth greeted him, but it did little to ease the weight in his chest. He sat on a wooden chair near the fire and stared into the flames. His quiet life, shaped by years of routine and self-reliance, felt suddenly fragile. He thought about the women, how close they had come to the edge, how their hands had trembled in the cold. He remembered the way they had thanked him, their voices steady despite everything. He had not seen fear in them then, only exhaustion and relief. He also thought about himself. He had chosen this life alone, not because he disliked people, but because he understood his limits. He knew how much responsibility he could carry and how much silence he needed to stay whole. The fire popped softly, sending a small spark upward. He realized that no matter what he chose, things would not return to the way they had been. The rescue had already changed him. The circle outside was proof of that. After a long while, he stood and opened the door. The cold rushed in again, sharp and clear. All eyes turned toward him, but no one moved. The older man waited, his expression unchanged. The man spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He said he respected their traditions, even if he did not fully understand them. He said he would never see the women as burdens or prizes. They were people whose lives had crossed his by chance and necessity. He explained that he could not make a decision based on pressure or fear. Any responsibility he accepted would have to come from respect, not obligation alone. He said he would not choose one life over another as if weighing objects. If he were to step forward, it would be with honesty and fairness. A murmur moved gently through the group, not disagreement but recognition. The older man listened closely, then nodded. He said the man's words carried weight. The choice was not meant to trap him, but to give him a chance to act with intention, just as he had at the river. He added that refusing was also a choice, but one that would carry its own consequences, not punishment but distance. The man took a breath. He looked at the faces around him once more. He saw no cruelty there, only expectation, tradition, and patience. "I won't decide in fear," he said, "but I won't turn my back either." The older man accepted this answer. He said that the man would be given time, but not endless time. Decisions, like rescues, lost meaning if delayed too long. With that, the older man stepped back. One by one, the group began to move away from the cabin, not leaving entirely but settling at the edges of the clearing. The pressure eased, though the presence remained. The man stood in the doorway, watching as the circle loosened but did not disappear. He understood now that this was not a threat, nor was it a test of strength. It was a test of character, one that could not be avoided by silence or distance. As night approached, small fires were lit beyond the trees. The land that had always been his alone now held others, quietly waiting. He returned inside his cabin, knowing sleep would be difficult. He lay awake listening to the sounds outside, soft voices, shifting steps, the occasional snort of a horse. None of it felt hostile, yet none of it felt simple. He realized that the rescue at the river had been the easiest part of this story. Pulling someone from ice required strength and speed. What followed required something deeper. Before dawn, he rose and sat again by the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes as he prepared himself for the next day. Whatever choice he made would shape not only his future, but the meaning of the night. He heard two voices in the storm and chose not to walk away. He next morning arrived slowly, as if the land itself was uncertain about what would come next. Pale light spread over the snow, touching the trees and the cabin roof. Smoke rose gently from small fires at the edge of the clearing where the visitors had rested through the night. The man stepped outside and breathed deeply. The cold was sharp, but it cleared his thoughts. No one approached him right away. That alone told him much. They were not there to force him. They were waiting for him to understand. He walked a short distance from the cabin, stopping near a tree where the snow lay smooth and untouched. He stood there quietly, listening to the forest. This place had always been his refuge. He had chosen it because it asked little from him beyond respect and hard work. Now, for the first time, the land felt shared. As the sun rose higher, the older man approached alone. His steps were unhurried. He greeted the man with a nod, then stood beside him, looking out over the clearing. "You are thinking," the older man said. "Yes," the man replied. "More than I usually do." The older man allowed a small smile. He said that thinking was good, but understanding was better. He explained more about why they had come, not repeating the demand but sharing the meaning behind it. He spoke of balance, of how actions tied people together even when they did not ask for it. He said that when someone stepped into danger for another, it showed a heart willing to carry weight. The man listened closely. He asked questions now, careful ones. He asked what would happen to the women if he refused completely. He asked what would be expected of him if he accepted responsibility in any form. The answers were honest. No threats were made. The older man explained that refusal would not bring harm, but it would close a door that had opened. Acceptance would not mean control or ownership, but commitment and presence. It would mean his life would no longer belong only to himself. That truth struck him harder than anything else. He had lived alone not out of fear, but because solitude allowed him to remain steady. Letting others close meant allowing uncertainty, loss, and change. Later that day, the two women arrived at the edge of the clearing. They did not come forward immediately. They waited, giving him space. When he noticed them, he felt a tightness in his chest that surprised him. They looked stronger now. Their steps were steady, their faces clearer. When they approached, they did so calmly. One of them spoke first, thanking him again, not with dramatic words but with quiet sincerity. She said they had not expected him to understand their ways, only to know the truth. The other woman added that they did not want his choice to come from guilt. They had survived because he acted without thought of reward. Whatever came next should be the same. Their words lifted something heavy from him. For the first time since the circle had formed around his cabin, he felt truly heard. That evening, he sat alone by the fire again. The flames moved steadily, just as they always had. He realized that his life before the rescue had been simple, but not empty. His life after, however, would be fuller, whether he wanted it or not. The only question was how he would meet that fullness. He slept deeply that night. The next morning he stepped outside before sunrise. Frost covered the ground, sparkling faintly. He stood at the center of the clearing where everyone could see him and waited. Slowly the group gathered again, forming a loose circle, not as tight as before. The older man stepped forward once more. The man spoke clearly, his voice steady. He said he could not pretend that the rescue meant nothing. It had changed him, just as it had changed the women. He said he would not choose between lives as if they were burdens to be measured. Instead, he chose responsibility in the way he understood it best, with honesty and respect. He said he would stand by both women as long as they wished him to. Not to decide their paths, but to support them if needed. He would not bind them and he would not walk away. His door would remain open just as it had been the night of the storm. Silence followed his words. It was not heavy or tense. It was thoughtful. The older man nodded slowly. He said the man had spoken with balance. The choice honored the act at the river without turning it into something harmful. The circle had no reason to remain. One by one, the group began to leave. There were no loud goodbyes, no celebration. The fires were put out. The land slowly returned to stillness. The two women remained for a short while longer. They spoke with the man, sharing simple stories, learning small things about one another. There was no pressure, no rush. When they finally left, it was with calm certainty, not fear. As the clearing emptied, the man stood alone again. But the solitude felt different now. It was not broken, only changed. He returned to his cabin, added wood to the fire, and sat down. Outside, the river continued to flow beneath the ice, carrying away the last traces of the storm. Inside, the man understood that some rescues did not end at the edge of danger. Some continued quietly, shaping lives long after the cold had passed. The days that followed felt quieter, but not empty. After the visitors left, the land around the cabin slowly returned to its natural rhythm. The tracks in the snow faded under new layers of frost. The smoke from many fires was gone, replaced by the thin line rising from the man's chimney alone. At first glance, it seemed as though everything had gone back to the way it was before, but the man knew better. He woke each morning with a new awareness. His routines were the same, chopping wood, checking supplies, watching the sky, but his thoughts were different. He listened more carefully to sounds in the forest, not out of fear, but out of connection. The land no longer felt like a wall that separated him from the world. It felt like a bridge. From time to time, he noticed signs of visitors, a fresh set of tracks passing nearby, a small bundle of food left on a flat stone not far from the cabin. No one announced themselves. No one demanded anything. These quiet gestures spoke clearly enough. The circle had broken, but the bond remained. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt at the edges of the river, he walked back to the place where the rescue had happened. The ice was thinner now, cracked and shifting. He stood there for a long time, remembering the fear in the women's voices and the strength it had taken to pull them free. He realized that the river had not changed. Only he had. Weeks passed. The winter loosened its grip, slowly giving way to longer days and softer air. The man found himself less restless at night. Sleep came easier. When he dreamed, it was no longer of ice breaking beneath his feet, but of walking through open land under clear skies. One evening, the two women returned. They did not come in haste or with ceremony. They arrived just before sunset, walking calmly through the trees. The man noticed them and stepped outside, greeting them with a simple nod. There was no tension between them, no expectation heavy in the air. They shared a meal by the fire. They spoke of ordinary things, the changing weather, the river, the work that filled their days. Their conversation was easy, unforced. The man realized that this was what true choice looked like. People meeting without pressure, without debt hanging over their heads. Before they left, one of the women told him that his decision had been spoken of among their people. Not as a story of demand or challenge, but as a story of restraint and respect. She said it reminded others that strength did not always come from control, but from knowing when to step back. That stayed with him long after they were gone. As spring arrived, travelers began to pass through the region more often. Some stopped at the cabin, asking for water or directions. The man helped when he could, as he always had. But now, people seemed to linger a little longer, as if they sensed something welcoming in the place. He did not become a leader or a symbol. He remained what he had always been, a man who listened, who acted when needed, and who respected the land and those who moved through it. The difference was that others now recognized those qualities. The river continued to flow, carrying stories far beyond the cabin. Some said a man lived there who once pulled two people from the ice without asking their names. Others said he was someone who understood that choices carried meaning beyond intention. The stories changed with each telling, but the heart of them stayed the same. One quiet morning, the man stood outside his cabin and watched the sunrise. Light spread across the snow, turning it gold. He felt no need to chase the future or return to the past. He stood firmly in the present, grounded in the knowledge that one moment of action had reshaped his life in ways he could never have planned. He understood now that saving a life did not always end when the danger passed. Sometimes it opened a door to responsibility, connection, and understanding. What mattered was how one chose to walk through that door. The cabin remained where it had always been, small and weathered, but it no longer stood alone in the same way. It had become a place of quiet meaning, known not for what it demanded, but for what it offered. And in that simple truth, the man found a deeper kind of peace, one that did not come from isolation, but from choosing to remain human in a world shaped by cold, silence, and choice.